Hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Juliette Yip and I'm Associate General Counsel at the CIB. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session as part of our first ever CIB Day. Thank you for joining us. Over the course of the day, you'll hear from several of my colleagues about our newest partnerships, innovative opportunities for project support in local communities, and how we're addressing some of Canada's most urgent infrastructure needs. Bonjour, je m'appelle Juliette Yip et je suis avocate générale associée à la BIC. J'ai le plaisir de vous accueillir à la séance d'aujourd'hui dans le cadre de la toute première journée BIC. Merci encore de votre présence. Au courant de la journée, plusieurs de mes collègues vous parleront de nos nouveaux partenariats, des opportunités innovatrices pour soutenir les projets dans les collectivités locales et de la manière dont nous répondons à certains des besoins les plus urgents du Canada en matière d'infrastructure. I'd like to start today's session by acknowledging that the land that we are hosting today's meeting from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We respect and acknowledge their lands and their people. Today's presentations are also available in French. To choose French audio, choose the interpretation function in your Zoom controls. For your awareness, sessions are being recorded. After today's discussion, we'll have some time for questions. So if you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box. Now, I'd like to kick off the discussion by introducing you to the CEO of the CIB, Mr. Ehren Cory. Ehren is here today to update you on the CIB's progress and new areas where we'll be partnering with communities and organizations across Canada to bring much needed infrastructure to life. Today, Ehren will be in conversation with Lisa Mitchell, the CEO of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, who many of you will recognize as an expert, a leader, and an advocate for this industry. I look forward to what's sure to be a very engaging discussion. Welcome, Lisa and Ehren. Bienvenue.
Thank you, Juliette. Lisa, nice to see
Thanks.
you.
Yes, good to see you too, Ehren. And thank you so much, Juliette, for the introduction. And welcome to the Market Update with Ehren Cory. I think, Ehren, this is our third one of these together, I think. So it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me again. I'm really looking forward to it. A lot of interesting stuff going on. You guys had a bit of an expanded mandate arrived this year in terms of housing and enabling infrastructure and Indigenous equity. You've been busy. You've been investing coast to coast to coast. You've got ports and airports and renewable projects, hydrogen, water and wastewater treatment, energy storage. I think you've got your first Indigenous equity loan and building retrofits. I mean, there's a lot going on. So I'm really looking forward to kind of jumping into it and really sort of understanding a bit, what this fiscal year has been like for you guys, and really maybe also to understand a bit about what you see as the future of the organization as you continue to evolve. Maybe I'll start there, Ehren, and hand it over to you just maybe to provide an overview before we get into the questions.
Well, thanks, Lisa, and thanks for doing this. As you say, we've been over the last several years trying to do every 6 months these updates to the market, and our goal really is to give a sense of where we've been and where we're coming from, and also a look forward at where we're headed. So I'm going to do that. Of course, I don't function very well without slides, so I'm going to use a few just to answer this overview question, and then you and I can get into an actual dialogue. And before I do that, I just want to say two things briefly. First of all, as Juliette said, this is the first time we are doing this day with multiple modules. So you and I are going to do our market update conversation, then we've got our breakouts looking at a number of the specific sectors we invested, and then we wrap up with our annual public meeting, which where I'll be joined by our board chair, Jane Bird, and we'll talk again, sort of a more summary view of the year past, financially and otherwise, and of the year ahead. So I think it's going to flow very nicely. I really appreciate, Lisa, you doing this with us, and I appreciate everyone who's joined us online. Second thing I wanted to say in beginning, and thanks again to Juliette for the land acknowledgement. I know people are coming to us from across the country, and all of us sit in Indigenous land. All of us sit in traditional territory. It's a really important part of the CIB's mission. June is an important month, Indigenous Peoples Month, and it is also Pride. And I think I just wanted to start by commenting, we as an organization, we as an industry, I think have both an opportunity and an obligation to build the kind of inclusive country we want to be, the kind of inclusive organization, certainly at the CIB, but more generally our industry, an industry that has historically been pretty male-dominated, pretty heteronormative, pretty white. And I think we have a real chance to change that. And I hope through the work of the CIB, but maybe perhaps even more importantly, our whole industry, through our collective work, creating an industry that's welcoming and thoughtful to the needs of Indigenous people and to the needs of our colleagues from many equity-seeking groups, and certainly from our LGBTQ2S plus colleagues. So I just wanted to start there. Okay, now I'll answer the actual question you asked me about our market update. And I really wanted to start just with the most basic overview of the CIB, now 6 years into this project that is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, where we stand. As you can see from the slide that hopefully is visible to you all, we're now really at a place of, I would say, stability and steady state. So our collective, this slide you're looking at is since inception for the CIB. As of March 31st, which is our fiscal year end, we reached 73 investments in projects, with $13 billion of CIB money committed to those projects, and the projects having total value of $36 billion. And the difference in those two numbers, of course, is that we're putting some of the upfront capital in, some of it comes from other levels of government and other partners from the public sector, and some of it comes, of course, from our private sector partners. And together, we are building $36 billion of infrastructure that was stuck on the sidelines, that was not happening in this country. And the little dots represent that. The dots are an imperfect representation because the truth is investments in, electric vehicle charging networks are cross-country. And you have to put a dot across the whole country to cover some of them. So we have tried our best to approximate where they are. And as you say, they give you a pretty good sense of coast to coast to coast where we are active. If I were to just zoom in on this past year that we've had, the subset is there were 27 new investments in year 23-24, which just ended on March 31st, with a value of $3.5 billion or so of the CIB's money and about $8 billion of total capital cost. What's perhaps more interesting than those numbers is the diversity in the types of projects, and Lisa, as you said, some of the new things that we've been up to. So this slide calls out a few projects. Each of them are unique in their own ways. The Nova Scotia Energy Storage Project, which is actually 3 separate battery storage facilities in Nova Scotia. What's unique about that project is it is our first, as you mentioned, Indigenous equity project. So we've actually made 2 loans for that project, one to the utility, NSPI, who are building the facilities, and a separate one to the WMA, which is an economic development corporation of the 13 Mi'kmaq nations in Nova Scotia. That was our first Indigenous equity loan, where we have loaned money to the Indigenous community and they are buying a meaningful stake in equity in the project. It's a big milestone for us. It's one we're really proud of. We're seeing so much uptake now, especially in the energy sector, but really across our portfolio, where Indigenous communities are looking for real seats at the table, both economic stake, but also stake in the direction projects take and how they get built. And so we're really proud of that one and look forward to many more. The Thompson Airport, a fascinating project. Airports are obviously a core part of the infrastructure of our country. The CIB hasn't made many investments in airports until this year. We had an investment in the train station at the Montreal airport. That was really a transit investment to connect the airport in Montreal to the downtown core as the REM gets built. But we hadn't invested in airports per se until this year. We had 2 of them worth noting. Thompson, which is a regional airport located in Manitoba, provides access to industrial opportunities in the north, to mining, but also to many, many Indigenous communities. It's a real gateway and a piece of infrastructure that was aging and at great risk. Unfortunately, as climate changes happen and the permafrost is not so perma, the building structurally was facing challenges, their water and wastewater systems were facing challenges, and so our investment really rehabilitated and gave new life to that airport. We also made an investment in the Montreal Metropolitan Airport, a loan to build a new passenger airport terminal on the south shore of Montreal, again, to create new transit connections and options. So airports have been really exciting for us. And then the Tilly Solar project on this slide, what's interesting about that, of course, it is also in partnership with 2 First Nations, the Chiniki and Goodstoney, and it's a and with private sector partners, and it is a really neat example of how public and private partnership can come together. It's a deregulated energy market, so the mechanics of is quite different than in most of the rest of the country in Alberta. And it's a loan and a project that we are really excited, and that is already deep in construction and heading towards operation. And so it's unique because it's going to be up and running before long. Just to go a little deeper on that, so one of the things you get lost in those numbers, Lisa, and I stand on lots of stages or sit today on stages, and $13 billion and 73 projects, and they start to become a little bit meaningless. We were a few weeks ago in Vancouver, British Columbia for the week, and on a Wednesday and a Thursday and a Friday, announced these 3 investments that are on your screen now. And I like this slide just because it sort of speaks in a more practical way to the breadth of stuff the CIB is now doing. So working with BC Ferries on starting the full electrification of their fleet. They have hybrid vessels in operation, but no pure electric vehicles. That is in the long term where they have to go. It is also a costly changeover, and so helping them to manage the cost of that and do it in ways that smooths the impact and allows them to keep providing service, super interesting. The export facility at Port of Prince Rupert, the can export terminal, a project we've been working on for several years with our partners at the port, with Indigenous partners and with shippers. This is a chance to change the trajectory of trade, to increase our export capacity. You have lots of stuff coming in off the West Coast, much less going out full. And in fact, that imbalance is a pretty significant issue economically. And it's a chance to do what infrastructure is supposed to do, grow the economy, increase productivity, give Canadian companies the chance to export to global markets. So we are really excited about that. And then the Friday, a very interesting investment in a partnership with HTEC, British Columbia government is also a partner in that project. Parts of the federal government have made a grant to it as well, so it's a real team effort. But this is to build out a hydrogen production facility and then distribution network to do refueling of heavy trucks. So imagine we're moving towards electrification of our cars, that's great. But for heavy trucks, for industrial use, for transporting long haul, electric does not seem like the only solution, let's just say at minimum, for heavy trucks. Maybe even not the first solution. The first solution might be more fuel cell based or hydrogen. So I give you that only to say we're busy. We're making if you did the math, 27 investments last year, that's 2 to 3 a month. And so in 1 week, you can kind of run a gamut. We called this our BC Transportation Week, but they're 3 very different investments. They have different goals. Some drive economic development, some drive climate goals. That's really what the CIB is all about. I wanted to talk about, Lisa, because I think it'll lead to a question, an accelerator investment that we just made in the last few weeks. This is in the Grays Bay project. There was a great article today about this project. Like many infrastructure projects in our country, it's one that's been on the books since long before the CIB even existed. More than a decade, communities in the far north, in both Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, industrial players, mining companies, the 6 communities in the area have all been working really hard towards getting this infrastructure built, and it hasn't been moving very far, very fast. And the combination of rededication to the project by governments and Indigenous leadership, by the companies that are in the area, there's been a big contribution in restarting the EA with financial commitment from a consortium of primarily mines and from the CIB. That combination, that's true public-private partnership, government, Indigenous leadership, companies, the CIB. We have re-kickstarted the EA process with really strong Indigenous and industry leadership. And we are really going to start moving towards a port, an air landing strip, all of the enabling infrastructure, and the road into the Great Slave geological deposit in a way that's going to open up economic opportunity for a part of this country that badly needs it. Super exciting to me. And as I said, the CIB, just to be clear, we're putting $3 million into some of those studies. We are not the headline of this story. The headline of this story is the industrial partnership, the Indigenous and Inuit leadership, and the governments of both the territories and Nunavut, and their focus on this project. We are an enabler to that, and that's the role we should be playing. And by just looking ahead a little bit, Lisa, and talking about where we're headed. Look, I just talked about our investments and the progress we're making. The goalposts never stay still, do they? Now the challenge is, oh, great, you're making all these investments, but where's the benefit? Well, look, The first few of our projects are now in operation. 2 projects are completed, as the slide says. Others are well into completion. I'm talking about the REM with its first phase to the South Shore open with riders. Irrigation pipes in Alberta providing irrigation. Broadband in southern Manitoba, our Valley Fiber investment. So a lot of these are deep into construction and starting to provide service to customers. Second, we've got a robust pipeline in every province of projects that are moving forward and territory. We're working hard not only on Grays Bay, which I mentioned, but more generally, the one place where if you looked carefully at the dots on the slide I showed you, there are not enough in the north. So figuring out the northern opportunity, the northern infrastructure needs is really important for us. And then the 2 big themes we see going forward, there's one around electrification and the clean power investments that's going to continue to drive. And the second is, as you mentioned, we're really focused now on how do we accelerate housing builds in this country and how can we use infrastructure as an enabler to that. Build the water and wastewater, the district energy systems, the local electricity distribution, all of the stuff that allows houses to go faster. That's the other big place as we look ahead that we're going to be focused. And that might be a good place for us to chat. Anyway, thanks. The rest of this will actually be Q&A. That was infomercial. Now I look forward to a discussion, but thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate it, Ehren. It's really good to kind of get that overview and sort of the perspective. And as I said, I mean, you guys have been extremely busy, but I think it's also, I appreciate, one of the things I think that's great about this space is not just number of projects and money out the door, but actually that impact, right? One of the things I've always loved is getting out to see the projects and the communities that you're actually helping. So I appreciate adding that flavor to it. I'll just remind for the audience as well too. I've got some questions for Ehren, but I'm happy to take some from the audience as well too. So there is a Q&A box that people, and I'll try and, we'll see what comes through, Ehren, if that's okay with you, and there might be some that pick up on some of the threads of what we're talking about. So please don't hesitate, folks, to put your virtual hand up. I'll see what I can do to get to as many of them as possible. But I know I just said, it's not always the numbers that are important, but I do want to talk about that a little bit because you've got, just this year, 27 projects, 3.5 billion of investments. I guess it seems pretty fairly consistent with the previous year, and so and do you think maybe then, do you see a world where you're actually tracking to 100 investments maybe in this coming year? And, and I guess there's always sort of that opportunities and challenges question, right? I always sometimes think the challenge can be also an opportunity, but, what do you think, those opportunities and challenges might be in getting to that milestone?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. If you looked at not just this year, but the last few years, we are into, I would say, a pretty steady state for the CIB, which means investments between $3 and $5 billion a year, 20 to 30 projects a year. And we think that is our consistent, that's what we think the market can manage. That's what we see as the pipeline of opportunity. And so that's kind of the rate we're now deploying quite consistently. So yeah, if you do the math and we're at 73 investments now, 100 has a ring to it, doesn't it? I think that if we did 27 again, mathematically, that's where we'd be. So that's where we're headed. That's the next thing we're tracking towards. And we've made already several announcements of investments this year, which, cyclically, historically, our investments have been much more in the fall and the winter. So the year is already off to a good start. I don't predict these things, but yeah, I think that's very much in the realm. I would say more generally what we're seeing is there's a base load of 20 to 30 projects, $3 to $4 billion every year of infrastructure projects that meet exactly our sweet spot, meaning great projects with great chance for public and private partnership, the chance for private capital to be in them. They have a revenue source to repay them, right? So there's a bunch of infrastructure that we're not in. But if you just looked at our universe, we think there's a very steady pipeline of that. And then every once in a while, there's a REM, there's a Darlington 2 years ago. These are some of our bigger investments. And so when those happen, the 3 to 4 becomes 4 to 5. Do you know what I mean? But I think there's sort of a base load, and then there are these large scale transformational projects. But that's the range we're playing in now, and I think we'll continue to. To your point about challenges and opportunities, I mean, certainly in any of our market segments, they face their own dynamics. You think of investments in the energy transition and the speed of those. We play a role in that, and our closing the gap that those projects face is something we can help in, but they're also dependent on the regulatory environment that they face and the price of alternatives, what's happening. So we control a part and not all. I think the key thing that we've learned, though, Lisa, is if we build great partnerships and relationships, we're there when the project fundamentals work. And what we're there to do is make those projects more doable. That doesn't make them automatically happen, but it means that we're there when it's time. And so, yeah, we like, you see little blips. Like sometimes people say, oh, there's an election coming in province X, our infrastructure project's going to slow down. And like, maybe for a few months. But I think the through line, if we are working closely with our partners on maturing those projects, when the conditions are right, we're ready to go. And so that's where we see the opportunity, and that's the way we've been operating now.
It'd be great to sort of get infrastructure projects outside of political cycles. We talk a lot about that, but it's good to see that there's opportunity for that work to kind of continue in places. And maybe just to kind of touch on just the bank and its mandate. I mean, you guys were created with, quite deliberately, I think, with a very broad mandate to allow some flexibility and some innovative thinking, right? But you've had your mandate broaden and expand year over year, I think, especially over the last 2 to 3 years to tackle new areas. And I mentioned at the outset, housing and Indigenous equity being sort of the new things. How do you think that's impacted the CIB's growth and your ability to invest in projects?
Well, I'm sure everyone listening has spent many hours reading the CIB Act. Lisa, you and I might be the only two, actually, in truth.
Possibly.
But you're absolutely right. It's actually quite short. Joking aside, you all could read it. It'd take you about 7 minutes max. It's a really short, and it sets some broad parameters about the kinds of projects that the CIB is, we're a tool in the toolkit. And so what the Act is really about is like defining our lane being revenue generating projects that have a form of repayment. So that rules out, public schools and hospitals and a bunch of social infrastructure. The lane talks about partnering with private capital, which again, rules out a few things that are purely publicly owned assets. We only invest in transit when there's also a private partner. So there are some big lanes, but after that, it is quite an open canvas. And I think that's absolutely appropriate because what infrastructure we need, roads, transit, electricity grids, those are absolutely going to continue to evolve based on our economy, our goals of economic productivity, and meeting our climate challenges. The shareholder of the day may have not radically different goals, but they might say, I want a little more of this and a little less of that. Those are all necessary and good. And I think the setup, the way this was set up was absolutely right, which is it's not build roads and build this and build that. It's build infrastructure that meet these core criteria. They're revenue generating. They draw in the private sector. They are net additive, therefore, to the infrastructure that we're otherwise getting built in this country. There's no point in me just building something that Saskatchewan was going to build anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's about an additive idea that we can get more built if you use a tool like the CIB. And the what evolves as society evolves. Like, we started, Lisa, as you know well, one of our goals is to get workable broadband to every Canadian. And when the CIB and we work with ISED, the Innovation Science and the UBF program to make that happen. Collectively we started on that, I think the estimates were about 12% of Canadians did not have 50/10 broadband to their home. Today, that number's in half. Through the investments we've made, through the investments the federal government has made, through the work of many provinces, through the work of ISPs. Again, we're one slice of that, but my point is, we're on the way towards that, and that's coming. So at the CIB, we now have to say, okay, but what else? What are the other forms of digital infrastructure we need? Where does this go next? So that's I think, part of the beauty. To your point, therefore, every year, I think the shareholder and our board are going through a dialogue that says, what are you seeing in the market? What do you think are the priority needs? Housing, when the CIB was created, there was not much talk about how housing would be enabled, how infrastructure could unlock new housing. That's a pretty important priority in our country these days. So guess what? It meets the basic criteria of revenue generating and having private and public participation. We should be looking at it. So lo and behold, we launched in 23-24 our Infrastructure for Housing Initiative, IHI, which is really just saying water pipes, local electricity distribution, transit, roads, all of those things are, concrete and steel and stuff, but actually what they can be is enablement to housing. And so we should think about investing in them more, And the CIB should think about investing in them as ways not just to build a new road or add a few feet of water piping, but to think of them as adding the potential for 10,000 new homes in community X. So yeah, housing and IHI, that program, and our Indigenous equity loans were two examples of that. If you went back the year before that, it would be low carbon fuels and nuclear. As we look forward, I think the next wave of digital infrastructure is one of those areas to think about. I think continuing around where are the opportunities in the energy transition is going to be really important. And every year, that's a dialogue between us and the shareholder of the day where we say, here's where we see the infrastructure market going, and they say, here's our public policy goals, and you marry the two together, and that becomes a new investable asset class for us.
Just to pick up, because the question did come through, you mentioned broadband, and big needs there, and it's great. You guys have, I think, announced about $2 billion worth of broadband projects, as you mentioned. Do you have a bit of a sense of, when households will be connected?
I'm going to mangle this. The federal government started with a goal. I should ask you. You still worked, I think, there at the time. The federal government started with a goal of every Canadian having 50/10 broadband by 2030. Then that got moved into, I want to say 2027, 28. And I think we remain on track for that. We don't own, as I said, we own the sliver of that is economic if you improve the cost of capital for people. So if I can go to an ISP who's already in a region and say, if you extend your network 50 kilometers further north or west, and pick up these additional 50,000 homes. You haven't done that yet because the density of customers isn't good enough to make the math work. But if I make you a loan, can we make the math work? That does not ever get us, Lisa, to, I would say, the last couple of percent, the most remote communities, the most off-the-grid communities. So I can't alone answer the question of when we're going to get there. In all honesty, I would need Simon Kennedy. I would need someone from ISED here to do that with me. But what I can say is for our piece of it, as you said, we're up to $2 billion. Of that $13 billion I talked about $2 billion of it is towards various broadband investments with small ISPs in northern Alberta, all the way to the ones we all know and love, TELUS or Rogers or Bell in larger communities or in different. So we've got a real mix of partners, sizes of projects, and we've got them in most provinces now, from Atlantic Canada all the way to BC and at points in between. So we're making, I think, really good progress on that. And as I said, that's great, and that still has several more years to run, but we're now asking ourselves, okay, what about AI and computing power? What are our data center needs as that's where we have to go next. And then that's a process where we say, this meets the basic funnel that I talked about earlier, being revenue generating, having private capital, being infrastructure broadly, and then we get a dialogue with the shareholder. Where does that fit in their priorities from there?
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity. I know we've been talking about it as well too, and looking at maybe having some discussions in the fall at our conference about sort of the digital and where do things go from now. So it'll be an interesting space to watch. I'll look forward to kind of seeing what you guys do in that space. I do want to kind of loop back as well too on the Indigenous equity piece. I mean, First Nations Major Projects Coalition has been doing our friend Nilo has been doing a lot of work in that space. You guys have been doing a ton of work with Indigenous communities, and you've got your first loan, your first Indigenous equity loan. So recent announcement by the government of a loan guarantee program. How do you envision the CIB sort of working alongside another federal program in the space?
Well, it's a really important question, and I just want to start, you're absolutely right. There are some amazing partners in this space. FNMPC, the First Nations Major Project Coalition, is one of those, and Nilo and their team, and Chief Gale, who's the chair, they've been great to work with. But there's also people like the First Nations Finance Authority who've been longtime players in this space, and we've sat down with them very recently. I think many of us are thinking to ourselves, gosh, we know that there's not too much money flowing into Indigenous communities or Indigenous projects, right? So let's start from the fact we need all of us and then some. So there's not this is a problem of, we don't need to be competing with each other, that's for sure. And the loan guarantee program and the CIB and the great work of folks like FNFA add it all together, and we're still short. So I think the big challenge is, how do you define ways to collaborate? So sharing information earlier and figuring out a stack of grant and loan guarantee and direct loan to the community, which the CIB could make, and low-cost loan that someone like the FNFA could make. Like, I think it's all about how do you create a stack? And I think all of us in this space, meaning the Indigenous space, are really attuned to this. What we don't want is for Indigenous communities to feel like, A, they should be shopping. You know, like, what can I get from them? What can I get from them? Because that's just, in the end of the day, going to slow things down. B, feeling like they're getting the runaround, like they got to ask them and then them. Like, that's not very customer-centric. So I think for many of us in this space, and in particular, we've been talking very closely with Ehren, who are the sort of the owners, if you will, of the loan guarantee program, and CDEV, who they've tasked with actually standing up the loan guarantee program. We've met with them. And right from the start, the conversation is, how do we streamline intake? How do we compare notes on who's working on which project? How do we create a stack that feels seamless to communities and development corporations? And I think that's the challenge for all of us in this space, from both the public and the private sector. And we're super lucky, Lisa, as you know well. We have an incredible team at the CIB working on Indigenous infrastructure in particular, a group of folks. And it's interesting, you know, it's a sort of small but mighty team within the CIB whose primary job is managing our partnerships with Indigenous communities. But not surprisingly, if you look at our staff writ large, their number one goal is to work on Indigenous projects. Like, it's a huge passion of many of the people at the CIB. It's not just about the 5 or 6 people leading our Indigenous investments. It's that for many of us at the CIB, that's a big opportunity. So we have a lineup of people who want to work on these deals on our side, and it's led by an incredible group of Indigenous leaders in the bank who I'm really proud of, and non-Indigenous leaders who have taken the time to get to understand those communities. So I'm really proud of the team we've built, and I know that team's going to figure out with their friends and colleagues in places like the First Nations Major Project Coalition and at CDEV and others, FNFA, how do we create a coherent stack that is easy for the people on the other side to leverage?
I think it's great that you guys are working together. I mean, you look at the Assembly of First Nations report that came out recently. I mean, the needs are staggering. So to your point, it's you know, more is better. But that collaboration and that coordination, I think, will be key, because the more and more you look at it, that Indigenous equity piece, then supporting their community needs, I think, is great. So it's great that you guys are not only in the space, but working with others that are there too, to make it as seamless as possible for folks looking to access the funding and investments.
I mean, one thing that's funny, I know it just requires a different mindset, but for the CIB, you have to always remember a basic thing, which is that as much as I talk about, it was $3.7 billion last year or something, $3.5 billion, our goal on any investment is to put the least amount of money in possible to enable the project to happen. Right? Like, our job in many ways is to say, what's the minimum? Because we're putting taxpayer money in at sub-market rates. If we put in too much, I could get my $3.5 billion up to 5 or 6, but to what end? Like, we're trying to get maximum bang for our buck. My point is, if we could put less in, and there's also a loan guarantee, and that loan guarantee allows the community to access a loan from a Canadian bank, this is awesome for us. So not only are we not in competition, our active goal is to find room for others, and if that allows us to put less in, our money can go further. We'll put more, less into more deals. That's like the ideal for us.
And just on that, I mean, the Globe ran a story earlier this week about the Cedar LNG project, and many sort of see that project as a top priority for Indigenous economic reconciliation. Do you see do you think there's a role for the CIB in that project?
Great question. I think, look, that goes back to our earlier discussion. Like, here's how this works, okay? We have very broad investment categories. So 5 sectors that we play in: transit, trade and transportation, clean power, green infra, and broadband. And on the green infra, each of those we break down, so clean electricity, generation and storage and transmission, all non-emitting forms. Like, there's a what we call the subsector breakdown. For green infrastructure, the same thing. It's carbon capture and storage, energy retrofits of buildings, district energy, our EV charging infrastructure, which was another new area for us last year, et cetera. And every year, our job is to engage with the shareholder and say, have we got the right subsectors within, in that case, the green infra world? So to be clear, LNG, fossil fuel-based in general, are not in those subsectors. So to answer your question, that's not a thing we would invest in today. But I'd also say, like, that is part of the ongoing that's why we have a shareholder, that's the government of Canada, and we have an ongoing dialogue, and that, because really, that's where commercial investment activity, which is what our bread and butter is, and public policy, that's where they meet. That's why we're a Crown Corp. It's up to the government and the shareholder to say, right, we want you in green infrastructure. We think for broadband, and it's our job to propose ideas and say, here's where those sectors might go, but it's ultimately their job to say that aligns to our policy goals or not. That's a kind of a bureaucratese answer, but honestly, the reality is no, we wouldn't or couldn't invest in those today, but also that's always part of what we're doing is understanding those are multi-billion-dollar projects, the couple of big, including Cedar, of course, the big LNG projects on the West Coast. So we're aware of them, we're talking to people about them, we understand the basics of them, and we have that dialogue all the time with our shareholder, and then you have to just make sure we're investing in the stuff that's aligned to what their priorities are.
And I think that's important for people to understand sort of how things work, and I think that ongoing sort of dialogue in terms of investment areas and public policy needs, I think is really critical. On that, I mean, there's a lot of focus lately on small modular reactors, very big area of interest, especially growing amongst the provinces in Canada as they're really struggling to meet electricity needs. You're also involved in OPG's Darlington project. So, are there others in that space that are in your pipeline?
Yeah, and you're right, and I'm glad you asked the questions in order because it's a great example, right? When the CIB a couple of years ago, in our subsector breakdown within clean electricity, it was silent on nuclear. And so, in the same way, like if you rolled the clock back, we had the same conversation. Hey, shareholder, let's talk about whether nuclear fits within this or not. And what's the policy alignment? Well, Canada has, the federal government has a nuclear roadmap. It was published in 2019. It talks about the importance of nuclear as part of Canada's baseload energy needs. It's part of the public priorities of many provinces in Canada as well. And so the budget of I think the spring of 2022, I guess that was, said, as we think about clean power opportunities, non-emitting sources of power generation, the CIB should be looking at nuclear. Okay, great. Then we did, and then we made an OPG investment, as you say. So that's the exact dialogue that you just asked about on something like LNG. That's what we did on nuclear, and that opened it up for us as an area of investment. And the simple answer to your question is yes. We're talking to other, as you know, there's like openly other provinces. Saskatchewan would be an example of this, who have New Brunswick, who have the view that if they're going to move to net zero electricity grids, having non-emitting baseload power in the form of nuclear is their only viable economic path. Some parts of our country are blessed with the geography that allows them to get that baseload from hydro, which is the other really amazing form of baseload non-emitting power. But if you're not that, or you're not fully that, Ontario has lots of hydro, but not nearly enough to meet our baseload needs. Nuclear is probably part of the solution. So we're talking to those jurisdictions, and I think there's real potential. And then even further out, I would say, Lisa, is what some people call VSM, very small modular reactors, the idea that in community, and now I'm thinking about industrial uses, I'm thinking about more northern and remote communities to the extent, and of course that's going to be up to those communities to decide whether they see nuclear in the form of small modular reactors as part of their solution or not. I would never, that's not for me to judge. But if they did, we are starting to have some of those conversations on the industrial side and with some nuclear forward communities, I would say. But I think those are a bit further out in the horizon. The technology maturity to do a 10 or 15 megawatt VVSMR is not quite there yet.
I mean, the magnitude of the electricity needs are quite large in this country, and especially as we sort of look to power our clean economy and keep our communities running. I mean, you mentioned EV charging earlier in the conversation, and so I'm curious though, and it leads a little bit back to the conversation we had around Indigenous. Are you seeing a greater number of Indigenous equity projects tied to these investments in clean power?
Yeah. So interestingly, I don't know how many. You can almost ask it the opposite, Lisa. Are there any clean power projects going forward in our country right now that don't have Indigenous participation? The answer is not that many.
Yeah, fair point.
Right?
Yeah.
So right now there's a call for power out in both Saskatchewan and British Columbia that are focused on renewables. Both of those calls have very clear criteria for Indigenous participation. And the CIB's involvement in those projects, again, sort of similar to what I said to you about Nova Scotia, it's very possible to imagine we may be involved in two different tranches, one in the project itself and the other in supporting Indigenous communities in having an ownership stake. So that's happening in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan and BC in their calls. I think Quebec, Hydro-Quebec, as they've planned their market, they've been very clear that they're planning on building a very different relationship with Indigenous communities than they might have had like long ago in their history. So we're seeing it across the country is the answer, and I think that's a good thing, and I think that's going to be very much part of our strategy in the clean power space. Ultimately, we're a lender to projects, and so each jurisdiction is different. How they go about engaging Indigenous communities will be different, and it's not our job to dictate that. It's our job to support however that's being done, but I would just say that's a very strong trend we're seeing.
And I guess similarly on the Indigenous equity, there's lots of players. And how does the CIB then relate to sort of the newly announced Clean Growth Fund?
So that's a great question. I think the historical. So first of all, we work really closely and collaboratively. We're both Crown corporations, and again, there's lots of room for both of our money and then some. If you look at the magnitude of our needs as a country. I think there's a theory that says that the growth fund, in its priorities, and if you read about it, are really focused on building the clean tech that Canada's going to need to both meet our own goals and to be globally competitive. And if you were to sort of map it, and I think the budget did this when they announced the growth fund, which you said newly announced, but I think it's a couple of years now we were working together. You could almost think of like a continuum where the growth fund if you look at some of their early investments, this plays out this way. Like they're investing in a thing like Ever, which is a really, I think, innovative and smart other option at non-emitting base load in the form of of industrial scale or grid scale geothermal kind of work. I think that's amazing. And if a province in Canada, was building that technology at scale, we might make a loan to it as it gets deployed as infrastructure. So I think there's a natural. Now, I think when you come to the space of the energy transition, the lines between what's clean tech and what's infrastructure deployment get blurrier. I think of carbon capture and storage, for instance, and that's where, in particular, I think our two organizations are really focused on working together and being able to provide let's call it an integrated package that makes sense for the industry. Again, it might be a slice from each of us. It might be that the CIB takes if you're thinking about carbon capture and storage, maybe the CIB is focused on the shared stuff, the pipes that are used to sequester, and the CGF is focused more on the technology behind fences. There's different ways to break that down, but we're working pretty actively together. The energy transition is the space where I think it is a little bit blurrier, and we get that comment from people, and it's up to us collectively, meaning us and the CGF together, to make sure that borrowers understand where we can each play. Like both of us can make investments, both debt and equity. Both of it. So we have to be very clear where one starts and the other stops. And I think we're making good progress on that.
Yeah, and you called me out on the new. Honestly, since March 2020, there's things in the work from home scenario, like my space-time continuum
Time is
just like shot. It's all relative these days. But
No,
yes,
I don't know.
right,
Yeah,
it's been a while, quite some time. Yeah. You did mention it just sort of in your response, the ability to provide loans and equity, which is sort of part of the bank's mandate. But we've seen you do a lot of loans, but not so much on the equity side yet. And is that something that you've considered? And like, I guess the question would be, like, what will it take for you to do that?
Right. Well, okay, two things. First, it's worth reflecting that you're absolutely right. Almost all of our investments have been debt, and specifically, almost all of them have been some form of subordinated debt. It is worth just reflecting on the fact, though, that in many of those investments, we are very much taking equity-like risks. So when we invest in an EV charging network, and we say payment is deferred until the chargers start to reach a certain utilization, and then payments step up as the chargers get busier and our interest rate steps up, and eventually our interest rate reaches the same price that commercial debt would, at which point we want you to refinance, go get money from CIBC or Royal Bank or whomever and take us out. That walks like a duck and talks like this. So there's a difference between what the instrument is, which in that case is a subordinated debt product, and what problem we're solving for the project, which is an equity capital-like problem. So I just want to draw a distinction. So when we think about an investment in something like EV charging, it's not a senior loan, it's not secured by the company, it's really so it's quite equity-like in its risk and it's the way we think about it, and that it has upside. It's not a pure loan, point one. So the paper is not the same as the risk profile. So we are already taking equity-like risk. But part two, the answer to your question is, what would it take? It would take that's the right tool for the project at hand. So what we've always said is we're agnostic, honestly, to the tool. Senior debt, subordinated debt, or equity. We're all about what's the problem we're solving. So in that EV project, the example I just gave, we did not start from, we should make a debt loan. We didn't start from we started from the help they need is in managing the uncertainty of ramp up of demand. Okay, what paper should we do that on, if you will? What form of contract should that be? Different question, but where we started 100% of our effort is, what's the problem that the project faces? How do we structure an investment that meets that? And look, I think the lesson we've learned out of that is there's a lot that a subordinated debt product can do to help both senior lenders on the one side of us, but also to help equity share in the incredible risk that they face and that they're taking. So yes, we have found that tranche of subordinated debt to be a really effective tool for managing both sides of that equation, but it's just a tool for us. And we start from always the question of what does the project need?
I could go on. Like I have tons of questions. It's been fascinating to sort of learn where you guys are at and how much you've accomplished over the year and where you sort of see things going forward. And I know there's questions that I'm not able to get to from the audience as well too. But as you said at the outset, you have a busy day.
You're trying to keep us on schedule.
That's right. That's right. You've got things to do. So I really appreciate the conversation, Ehren, and wish you guys the best of luck for the rest of the day. And I think with that, I'm handing it back over to Juliette.
Thank you. And before you do, Lisa, I just want to say thanks back to you. I know some council members will be online. I've been a long-term member of C2P3, and I just want to say the thinking that the thought leadership that the council's providing, the push towards constantly rethinking what does public-private partnership really even mean in this country, I really appreciate it. I encourage all the people on our little virtual fireside chat minus the fireplace to keep doing that, to keep collectively thinking about where do we want to go as an industry. I think for a while, and I say this as the former head of an agency that did this, but I think for a while we got a little bit stuck, victims of our own success, if you will. We had an availability-based P3 model in this country that worked, and we kept doing it. And that is not today. That's not the CIB. That's not the council. That's not what many of the players in the industry are doing anymore. It's certainly not what markets like electricity, which was not typically the home of our Canadian-based P3s, I think we're seeing an absolute explosion in the ways that we're doing this. And I just wanted to send a shout out to council members who might have joined us today to say, keep doing that thinking, keep pushing us to new places. I think there are if you take the essence of public and private partnership, we are seeing it in so many different forms and ways. And I think there's great opportunity for us as an industry.
But really appreciate your support ongoing, Ehren. And I think we're going to pick up on that, do some work on that area together. I'm looking forward to it. So, all right, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. And by the way, Ehren, I think I'm one of those people who read the CIB Act, and not that I think, I know, because the job requires it. But so thank you everyone for joining us today and for your questions. I'd especially like to thank you, Lisa, for joining us today and guiding us through this very, very interesting discussion, and Ehren for sharing your thoughts. Merci à toutes et à tous de nous avoir rejoints aujourd'hui et d'avoir posé vos questions. J'aimerais tout particulièrement remercier Lisa pour sa présence aujourd'hui et de nous avoir guidés dans cette discussion fort intéressante, ainsi qu'Ehren pour avoir partagé ses opinions et ses réflexions. We have several more sessions as part of CIB Day, as Ehren has mentioned, including discussions with some of our investment leaders, as well as the CIB's annual public meeting. To continue on your CIB Day journey, return back to the CIB Day homepage using your browser or by using the link in the chat. Thank you and have a great day. Merci et bonne journée.